Hello everyone. In this lab presentation, we're going to cover the components of the axial skeleton. In our last lab presentation, we covered the skeletal system introduction, where we discussed the different types of bones, the different classifications of bones, and the different types of bone markings. In general, we want to understand what bone is and how it's arranged. But in this presentation, we're going to start learning the individual bones of the skeleton and the specific bone markings that each of those bones contains. So the skeleton can be separated into two major branches, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is composed of all of the bones that make up the skull, all of the vertebrae that compose the vertebral column, and all of the bones that participate in the thoracic cage. Sometimes we call the thoracic cage the bony thorax or perhaps the rib cage. In total, the axial skeleton contains 80 bones, and we can see on the left side of this picture the axial skeleton highlighted in blue. The appendicular skeleton, which is our second branch, is shown here highlighted in red. And we'll discuss this branch of the skeletal system in our next lab presentation. But this lab video is going to focus on the axial skeleton of all the bones that make up the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage specifically. The axial skeleton is named because it's on the axis of our body, and it is from the axial skeleton that our bones can rotate from side to side. The appendicular skeleton is named because it includes our body's appendages. So we'll see the shoulder girdle, the arm, the pelvic girdle, and the leg all composing the appendicular skeleton. We will see this picture again when we get to the appendicular skeleton, but let's jump right into the bones of the skull. So when I was much younger, before I took my first anatomy and physiology class ever, I used to think the skull was one bone, and boy was I wrong. The skull, in fact, is composed of many different bones that are all articulating at different places. We can describe the bones of the skull as fitting into two groups, either cranial bones or facial bones. Cranial bones, as they sound, participate in making up what we know as the cranium. That's the upper part of the skull that contains the brain. And we'll also have facial bones, which will participate in making up the structure of the face. The bones that can be classified as cranial bones are the frontal bone, the two parietal bones, and the two temporal bones, the occipital bone, the ethmoid bone, and the sphenoid bone. The bones that can be classified as facial bones are the two zygomatic bones, the two lacrimal bones, the nasal bone, the maxilla and the mandible, as well as the palatine bone and the vomer. On the next series of slides, we're going to start identifying these different bones and seeing where on the skull they can be found. So at first glance, you can see that this picture will look a little bit different than a typical skull will. The bones of this skull are depicted in different colors so that you're able to see clearly where each of these bones begin and end. While we will be learning the bones of the skull on this picture, I want to be very clear and let you know that on the midterm exam, you will not have a colored skull to depict its different bones. So while this picture will be very beneficial to you in learning the bones of the skull, you'll have to make sure that you can identify each individual bone on a real skull. So the first bone on the skull that we're going to see is the frontal bone. This is known as the frontal bone because it's found on the front side of the skull. The frontal bone is one of our cranial bones, and you could see it here depicted in yellow. I personally find that the frontal bone is named rather appropriately. We'll also find this pink bone in here is known as the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone is articulating with the frontal bone, and the sphenoid bone tends to look different based upon the view that you're looking at the skull with. One of the best ways to view the sphenoid bone is from a superior view, and in order to get that view, we have to shave off the top part of the cranium and we'll be looking inside of the cranial cavity. I will elaborate much further on the sphenoid bone on later slides, but for now, just focus on getting these bones identified. The third set of bones that we're going to see on the skull are the parietal bones. The parietal bones are depicted up in green here, and from this view they actually look rather small, but that is not the true nature of the parietal bones. The parietal bones are actually going to cover the majority of the brain, specifically the parietal lobes, and there are two parietal bones, one on either side. These bones will be much easier seen from a lateral view or perhaps a posterior view, and we will see that very shortly. Just under the parietal bones, where the temples can be found, we'll find the temporal bones. Now, the temporal bones and the parietal bones are paired bones. There's a right temporal bone and a left temporal bone as well. Our left temporal bone will be on the left side, and this will be our right temporal bone. Again, we name the temporal bone because that's where the temple can be found. And what we will come to see about most of these bones of the skull is that each of them are named very, very appropriately. Our understanding of anatomical terminology can be utilized for identification of the bones. So in general, the side of the skull is known as the temporal region. And while we have a temporal bone, we're also going to have a temporal lobe of the brain that sits just under the temporal bone, and we'll also have a temporalis muscle that will sit on top of the temporal lobe as well. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go through the rest of these bones. The fifth bone that we're going to see making up the skull is known as the ethmoid bone. And the ethmoid bone, just like the sphenoid bone, can be a little hard to visualize until we've pulled that bone out of the skull. And I will show you a slide where the ethmoid bone has been entirely removed and we can see its unique bone markings. But for now, the ethmoid bone is this bone found right here in front of the sphenoid bone that can be depicted in orange. So we're going to move to a lateral view of the skull, and a few things have now become visible that we couldn't see otherwise. First and foremost, you can see how large the parietal bones actually are. On the last slide, they looked rather tiny, and so did the temporal bones. So you can see that these bones are actually quite large on the side of the head. These pictures will all show you the same colors to each of these bones, so you'll see the parietal bones over here, the frontal bone shown here, we've got our temporal bone, which can be found on this side. And what we can now see about the temporal bone is that there's a lot of different bone markings on this. This is a very intricate bone, and it will have lots of bone markings. We'll see the sphenoid bone is this pink bone that can be shown here. The sphenoid bone will again be much better viewed once we've pulled that out of the skull, but this is how it will look from the lateral view. And we'll also have the occipital bone that can be found on the back side of the head. The occipital region was found on the backside of the head, so the occipital bone will sit back here and cover up the occipital lobe of the brain. The skull is a place on the body that contains a very special junction, known as a suture. Sutures are very, very tight junctions that have very little connective tissue between them, and we see the bones of the cranium are actually meeting together and form sutures. Sutures can be seen in the place between two bones where two bones come together. Specifically, we'll have 4 sutures, and we can see 3 of them on this slide. We have the coronal suture, the lambdoidal suture, and the squamosal suture. So let's break down these sutures and see which bones participate in them. So the first suture that we're going to discuss is the coronal suture. Now, if we think back to the anatomical terminology presentation, you may remember that we have different planes and sections that we will use to separate the body. One of them was the frontal section, also known as the coronal section, which separated the body into a front and back piece. The coronal suture lies within a coronal plane, which is where it gets its name. This suture is formed by the articulation of the frontal bone with the 2 parietal bones. We will also see that we have the squamosal suture. The squamosal suture can be found between the parietal bones and the temporal bones. One way that I like to remember the squamosal suture is that this suture is roughly shaped like an S. And lastly, on this slide, we'll have the lambdoidal suture, which can be found back here between the parietal bones and the occipital bone. The lambdoidal suture is much better viewed from the posterior view, however. We can see from this view we've got our parietal bones over here, and you can now see that there's a 4th suture, which gives rise to 2 different parietal bones. We'll have our occipital bone and our temporal bones that can be found here, so this suture would be that squamosal suture, and this suture is going to be the lambdoidal suture. I always remembered the lambdoidal suture because if you tilt your head, this will roughly look like a very abstract letter L. The last suture that we have is the sagittal suture, which will sit in the sagittal plane. This suture is formed by the articulation of the 2 parietal bones. So this view is going to show us the superior view of the skull after we've shaved off the top of the cranium. We've had to cut through the frontal bone and the 2 parietal bones to get this view. But what we can see once we get in here is a much better view of both the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone. I've mentioned that these bones will look very different depending on the view because of the way they sit within the skull. You can see that the sphenoid bone is actually much larger than it looked on our other slides, And the ethmoid bone has some other unique structures that can be seen on it from this view as well. You can see the frontal bone, the two parietal bones, the two temporal bones, and the occipital bone, which can all be seen right here. So once again, we can see from this view how different the sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone look depending on how we're orienting the skull. Now at this point, we've discussed most of the bones of the cranium, and now we're going to transition into some of the bones of the face. So the first of which is the nasal bone. I like the nasal bone because it's found on the nose. That's a nice little easy way to remember the name of this bone. We also have this purple bone, which is known as the maxilla. The maxilla is truly one of the largest facial bones, and it contains the top row of teeth. The bottom row of teeth can be found embedded in this bone known as the mandible. The mandible refers to the jaw bone. As we move towards the cheeks, we'll see the zygomatic bones that can be found on either side. These are paired bones, and we'll also find the lacrimal bones, which sit just in front of the ethmoid bone. The lacrimal bones are these green bones here, and they're one of the smaller bones that can be found on the face. So in this view specifically, we can see the frontal bone, the two parietal bones, the two temporal bones, the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone, the lacrimal bone. We've got the nasal bone, the maxilla, and the mandible. And I can't leave out the zygomatic bones. There's only two other bones that we'll have on the skull, known as the palatine bone and the vomer. And we can see those bones much more nicely from the inferior view. So you can see this is our maxilla, shown here, and the palatine bone is going to be just behind the maxilla, making up part of the hard palate. So that's why we call it the palatine bone. And just behind the palatine bone, we'll find the vomer. The vomer is going to be one of the smaller bones of the skull, and it's going to help make up the nasal septum. One of the better ways to view the vomer and the palatine bone are on this slide. You can see the vomer shown here and the palatine bone shown here based on their colors. We'll find the ethmoid bone that's also going to be participating in the nasal cavity. We can find our frontal bone and our nasal bone found up here. The lacrimal bone can be found here, and lastly we'll have our sphenoid bone, which can be found back here. So as you can see, the skull is made up of many different bones. Each bone is going to serve its own purpose for the entire structure of the skull. Now we're going to transition into the bone markings that can be found on the bones of the skull as well. And we'll get started with the bone markings that can be found on the ethmoid bone, the sphenoid bone, and the temporal bone. The ethmoid bone has 4 bone markings on it that we will need to be aware of. And specifically, we can see 2 on this slide. We can see the central line on the ethmoid bone that's going to project more superiorly. Remember, we're looking at the skull from a superior view, so this bone marking is going to be shown moving more superiorly. This structure is known as the crista galli. We refer to it as the crista galli of the ethmoid bone. We'll come to see in just a couple slides, when I show you the ethmoid bone pulled out of the skull all on its own, that the crista galli sticks up and courses along the center of the ethmoid bone. I often like to refer to the crista galli as the mohawk of the ethmoid bone because of this arrangement. Now on either side of the crista galli, we'll have 2 cribriform plates. These cribriform plates are flat structures of bones that contain many different holes. And when you get into anatomy and physiology too and start discussing the special senses, you will come to learn about the function of the cribriform plates. The cribriform plates have these holes so that the cells of the nervous system can project upwards through them and eventually bring smell information back to the brain. The cribriform plate is found just above the nasal cavity, so these are going to be very useful in that special sense. So in the center we've got the crista galli, and on either side we have the cribriform plates. Again, we do have 2 other structures on the ethmoid bone, and we'll see those on future slides. Now the sphenoid bone will only have 2 structures that we need to be aware of. Specifically, the optic canals, of which there are 2, and the sella turcica, of which there is just 1. The optic canals can be found here. And the purpose of the optic canals are to give the optic nerve the ability to travel out to the eyeball so that we can bring vision information back to the occipital lobe of the brain. The optic nerves will pass through the optic canals, and since we have 2 optic nerves going out to 2 different eyeballs, we'll have to have 2 different optic canals. Now the sella turcica is a saddle-shaped structure that can be found on the superior aspect of the sphenoid bone. You can see this here But I'll move back to this slide just to show you that the sella turcica will be positioned right here. This individual structure is very useful because it contains the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland will project out from the hypothalamus of the brain, and it will sit in the sella turcica. So that structure can be found right here. Now the temporal bone, as I've already mentioned, has many different bone markings on it. But in fact, most of those bone markings can be found on the exterior side of the skull. We'll only see one specific bone marking on the inside of the temporal bone, and that is known as the internal acoustic meatus. I mentioned in our last lab presentation that we have an external acoustic meatus, which can also be known as the ear hole. That's going to be the hole that you put the Q-tip in. But the internal acoustic meatus will also be necessary so that the cranial nerves that will travel out and bring hearing information in from the ears will have a place to go. So these are the internal acoustic meati. These can be found on the interior side of the temporal bone. So now we're going to take a look at the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone as they've been pulled out of the skull. This is how the ethmoid bone will look like on its own. And you can see right away the crista galli and the cribriform plates. You can see from this picture why I call the crista galli the mohawk of the ethmoid bone. And on either side those cribriform plates will be so that our neurons will be able to project axons upwards so that we can bring olfactory information in for our sense of smell. But I also mentioned that the ethmoid bone has two other bone markings, specifically the nasal conchae and the ethmoid sinuses. The nasal conchae are these large bone projections that stick out of the inferior side of the ethmoid bone. Underneath the nasal conchae will house the openings to our different sinuses. The ethmoid sinuses can be found in the ethmoid bone. And remember, sinuses are just spaces in bones that will add resonance to the voice and lighten bone. So you can see the ethmoid sinuses on the side of the ethmoid bone above the nasal conchae and below the crista galli and the cribriform plates. Once we've pulled the sphenoid bone out of the skull, you can see why we often call this the butterfly bone. The sphenoid bone will have these two wing shapes on either side, and it will contain the two optic canals and the sella turcica, where the pituitary gland will sit. So the optic canals will contain the optic nerves, and the sella turcica will contain the pituitary gland. From the inferior view, we can again see the sphenoid bone, the temporal bone, and the occipital bone. And on this slide, we're going to discuss the different bone markings on the occipital bone. Arguably, the most prominent structure that can be found on the occipital bone is the foramen magnum. This is one of the most important foramen of our entire body, as the spinal cord will project through the foramen magnum from the brain and into the vertebral canal. We can hopefully remember that a foramen refers to a hole. And I did use this example in our last lab presentation to discuss what a foramen is. So this is going to be a large hole that's found in the occipital bone. Right next to the foramen magnum, we'll find the two occipital condyles. Condyles, remember, are projections for joint formation. And the two occipital condyles will be the bone markings that can be found on the occipital bone that will be used to articulate with the first cervical vertebrae. Our last bone marking for the occipital bone is the superior nuchal line, which we can see right here. Now in this picture, I'm well aware that the superior nuchal line looks as though it's actually rather inferior. But we must remember that the skull is already oriented in the inferior view. So this is actually going to be quite a ways up the occipital bone. This is our superior nuchal line. We can hopefully remember that a line falls under our bone marking category of projections for muscle, tendon, and ligament attachment. So this superior nuchal line is going to serve as an area for muscle tendons to come and attach to the skeletal system. One other thing that I will mention about the superior nuchal line in particular is that all of our bone markings will be named very reasonably. We don't include any useless words in our bone markings names. So the superior nuchal line is indicated here because we also have an inferior nuchal line here. If we didn't have this inferior nuchal line, we would just have called this the nuchal line instead of the superior nuchal line. So that's a little trick that you can use when trying to identify these bone markings. We're now going to see for the first time truly how many bone markings can be found on the external surface of the temporal bone. So we can remember the temporal bones are shown in orange on either side of the skull. And on the inside of the temporal bone, we had the internal acoustic meatus. But one thing that you can see here about the temporal bone is it's going to have this projection that will eventually come together with the zygomatic bone. And they form this structure known as the zygomatic arch. So it's very important that you understand that the zygomatic arch refers to this entire structure that is formed by both the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone. And we will have separate names for the individual parts of these bones that make up the zygomatic arch. In particular, we can see that this structure is known as the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Since the temporal bone is projecting this process outward to meet and fuse with the zygomatic bone, we call this the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. That's very important that we understand that distinction. This is actually known as the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Both of these structures are what contribute to the zygomatic arch. Now, as we move back here, we're going to see this other structure that we've seen before. This hole or canal that can be found in the temporal bone is known as the external auditory meatus. You can also refer to this as the external auditory canal or perhaps the external acoustic meatus as well. I often refer to this as the external acoustic meatus, so I'd like to make sure that you know this by both names. This again is colloquially known as the ear hole. Now, as we move to a more inferior position, we'll see that the temporal bone contains two other holes in it as well. We have the carotid canal and the jugular foramen. The carotid canal is found anterior to the jugular foramen. And the jugular foramen can be found just behind the carotid canal and a little bit bigger than the carotid canal as well. I always remembered the jugular foramen because the shape of the jugular foramen's hole is in the shape of a J. This hole is not perfectly round, and it will generally be shaped as a little bean, or perhaps the letter J, to indicate that we're looking at the jugular foramen. The carotid canals will contain the two internal carotid arteries, and the jugular foramen will contain the two jugular veins. This lateral view gives us another way that we can view some of these bone markings on the temporal bone. You can see the external acoustic meatus, which can be found right here, and we'll also find that zygomatic process of the temporal bone shown here, participating in the zygomatic arch that can be formed by both the temporal bone and the zygomatic bones. We'll have three other bone markings that can be found on the temporal bone, namely the mastoid process, the styloid process, and the mandibular fossa. The mastoid process is a large bony bump that can be found behind the ear. I always like going over the mastoid process because this is a structure that you can feel on yourself. You can actually put your hand behind the ear and you'll feel that bony bump. That is the mastoid process. Now, slightly anterior to the mastoid process is the styloid process. This is a very pointy structure that can be found more inward in the skull, and this will serve as an attachment location for certain muscles. We'll also note that the mandible will come in and articulate with the temporal bone here at the mandibular fossa. Remember, a fossa is a basin-like structure or bowl that can be found on a bone. So this is going to indent into the bone and give the head of the mandible a place to sit within. The frontal bone will be our second to last skull bone that will have bone markings, and it will only have two. The first thing that we need to note about the frontal bone is that it's going to have this ridge along the brow. This is known as the glabella of the frontal bone. And despite the arrow just pointing to the center, the entire ridge of the brow is known as the glabella. Now, on the glabella, at the superior aspect of the orbit, we will find one other bone marking, known as the supraorbital notch or the supraorbital foramen. Depending on your genetics, you may have a notch, you may have a foramen. But this is another structure that you can feel at the superior aspect of the orbit. We've already learned the nasal conchae on the ethmoid bone, but we can actually see those from an anterior view sticking out right here. These are the nasal conchae. So our last skull bone markings will be found on the mandible. Up here we'll have the mandibular condyle that can be found on the head of the mandible, and we'll find two foramen that can be found on the mandible as well. Here we'll find the mental foramen, and over here we'll find the mandibular foramen. Now, something's very different about two of these foramen. The mental foramen can be found on the exterior aspect of the mandible, and the mandibular foramen can be found on the interior aspect. And that's why we can't see the mandibular foramen on this side. These will be paired structures. We'll have two mandibular foramen, one on each side, and we'll also have two mental foramen. And we can actually see the two mental foramen right here on the mandible. So we've got these two foramen that can be found on this bone, as well as the lower row of teeth. So that pretty much concludes the bones and bone markings that we have on the skull. We've now covered all of the bones of the skull and their individual bone markings that you'll need to know on each one. There are in fact a final 6 bones that can be found on the skull. 3 will be found on each side. They are known as the ear ossicles. The ear ossicles are the tiniest bones that can be found in the body, and they're found inside of the middle ear cavity, which can be found in the temporal bone. There are 3 ear ossicles on either side of the skull, and they are known as the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. These 3 bones will articulate in this order, and these bones are often referred to as the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. The malleus is said to look like a hammer, the incus is said to look like an anvil, and the stapes is said to look like a stirrup. But sorry to say, I was never able to see that personally, so on your quiz, these will be the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. I want you to understand how these ear ossicles articulate with each other, and in what order. The malleus will be touching the tympanic membrane, which is also known as the eardrum, and articulate with the incus. The incus will articulate with the malleus and the stapes, and then the stapes will articulate with just the incus, and then transmit mechanical signals into the inner ear through what is known as the oval window. You will cover these 3 ear ossicles in much more detail when you get to the special senses lab, but for now, just know these different bones and in what order they articulate.